Mr. Davis did a great job on the scans. I'm going to do a little review on the brain scans for you just to make sure you got this down because there's usually questions about these, and it's not like you need to know what they look like necessarily, but you need to be able to describe them. So let's take a look at which scans show activity or function in the brain. Now remember, the EEG was the electrical activity. They'll put electrodes on your brain, and what you see is how much activity each part of that brain is using. So it's just going to be little squiggles. That's the EEG. It's not using magnetism or radioactivity or anything else, but it shows activity. CAT scan doesn't show any activity. A CT scan, that is just like a really nice X-ray, as is an MRI. So we're not going to see any activity in the brain. fMRI, the F stands for functional. So we get to see which parts of the brain are metabolizing glucose. So we get to see which parts are working. So it would be an fMRI. And then a PET scan, positron emission tomography, that tells us what parts of the brain are metabolizing this radioactive stuff. So we just say EEG, fMRI, and PET, which are in color. The only two that are in color are these last two because we will see things glow when the brain is getting information or is using that glucose there. And we'll see a PET scan. We'll see in PET scans, if you're getting a PET scan, that's usually a bad thing because they're looking for tumors. They're looking for things that are metabolizing things faster, and tumors are just fast-growing cells, and they would be eating that radiation super quickly, so we'd see them glow. So it'd just be those last two. Which use radiation? Again, EEG is just the squiggles. CT scan, that does use radiation. It's just a big old X-ray. The MRI does not use X-rays. It uses a magnet. Takes a lot longer because it uses a magnet. That's why if anything ever happened to you, like Mr. Davis was talking about, something happens to you and you need to get looked at really fast, they'll just do a CAT scan. It's like an X-ray, but it's 3D. You don't want a lot of them, but you get to see basically if your brain's bleeding, they want to know super fast. MRI would be something if we want something a lot more precise. It's going to take us about an hour, but we're not worried about you bleeding to death or anything like that. So radiation would be the CAT scan. The fMRI doesn't use any radiation. It uses a magnet same way, and it just is using function. But the PET scan injects radiation. Very quick half-life on that radiation, so it's not going to harm you once or twice. You don't want to do it too often. So it's just a cat and a pet. A cat pet. You think your cat pet has radiation, which shows the brain itself. All of these show the brain itself, except for the EEG. Again, the EEG just shows us those little squiggles, the electroencephalogram. And then which would be most useful for showing soft tissue? Again, we've got that MRI is going to be really, really, really precise on that MRI. It's going to take a long time, but it's super nice. So you might want to go back and look through it, look through the previous video, but that's a nice little review. Which ones are 3D? EEG is not 3D. It's just, again, it's 2D, up and down. And then really, in a way, what we're talking about with fMRI and PETs is they're in 4D. As Mr. Davis was talking about, because we have time as well. But all of these are in 3D. These two are in 4D, so it would be all but the EEG. Now, I know that's a lot. Some of you are going, holy crap, Mr. Woodard, you keep just using all these acronyms and I'm lost. That's all right. That's why we record these videos. You can watch it again, you can review, you can make sure you got it. Okay. This is really important. We're going to start talking about the brain, and this is going to get super involved. So the first thing I want to look at is I want to look at the brain on a very macro level. So what parts of the brain are there? So instead of going through all the really, really small things, let's look at the three main parts. So the brainstem and the cerebellum. This is the oldest part of the brain. This is the most basic part of the brain. Reptiles have a brainstem and a cerebellum. So this is not what makes us human. This is not what makes us apes. This is not what makes dolphins smart. This is your basic, any living thing, even non-mammals like reptiles have a brainstem and a cerebellum. It just allows you to live. Vital functions, the basic stuff. If you don't have a brainstem, you're not going to live. Piece of trivia, you can get locked-in syndrome where you can have a stroke where the base of your brain is paralyzed. It's lost. So you are on life support the rest of your life, but your thinking part of your brain is still intact. There's a great movie about it called The Diving Bell and the Butterfly, a true story about a guy who had that type of stroke that killed the base of his brain. So one of my favorite movies actually of all time, Diving Bell and the Butterfly. Watch it. Okay. So we have the brainstem and the cerebellum, which is right here. And then we have the limbic system, which is in the middle of your brain. So think of it, I wish I had my brain here, I'm at home. But so we've got the brainstem coming up here and the cerebellum right here on the back. So brainstem and cerebellum. And then on the inside of your brain, just this, so we've got the brain surrounding it. On the inside is what we call the limbic system. And this is where we get emotions and memories. So when you start thinking this is more complex, this is a little bit more human, this is where our feelings come in, this is where the amygdala comes in. And we're going to talk a lot about the amygdala. The amygdala, the hippocampus, all those parts that are not just about breathing and being alive, but about how we feel, okay? So that's the limbic system. I don't actually know the etymology of the word limbic. I'll have to look that one up. Maybe Mr. Davis can look it up for next time. And then we have the cerebrum. And the cerebrum is actually what you see here. Most of what you see in the brain is what they call the cerebrum. Now, this is the cerebellum, which basically means little cerebrum because it looks like a little brain back here, and this is your big brain. This is about 2/3 of your brain by weight and by area. So this is so much of what makes you a higher functioning being. Now, I'm not going to say nobody knows. But it sure seems like when we were first, you know, hundreds of thousands, maybe millions, who knows how long we've been around, I don't know. But so many years ago, we just had the brainstem and the cerebellum. We were basically just staying alive. Then we got the emotion part on the top and we started having a little bit more feelings. And then we put the cerebrum on the top of that. That allows us to write symphonies. That allows us to build skyscrapers. That allows us to write poetry, all that other stuff. That's what makes us us, what makes us human. And what's really interesting about that is if you look at some of our closest relatives, the apes and the chimpanzees and such, you'll look at their brain and their brain looks a lot like ours. It has the brainstem and the cerebellum, has the limbic system, has a lot of the cerebrum back here, but it's missing this. If you look at a chimpanzee and you look at them in profile, they don't have a big frontal lobe, a big prefrontal cortex. So this part right here is the last part that got developed. This is what really makes us human. And we're not going to talk about that quite yet, but this part is super important. So again, you got the brainstem and the cerebellum on the back of the head. You got the limbic system right on top of that, and then you've got the cerebrum around the outside. I'm going to start talking about the brainstem first, then we're going to move up to the limbic system, then we're going to move up to the cerebrum. I don't even know if I'm going to get through the whole brainstem today, but let's at least take a look. So here's the brainstem and the cerebellum. And the way it's labeled, it's a little confusing, but I'll talk to you about it. So let's talk about what's in the brainstem. This is really the top of the brainstem, and it's the thalamus. And we're going to see the thalamus and the hypothalamus. And if you know your terms, you know that hypo means under, so the hypothalamus is going to be under the thalamus. We'll talk about the hypothalamus later. The thalamus is the switchboard operator of the brain. So, for instance, I'll just give you the most basic. If information goes from our eyes, goes to our thalamus in the middle of our brain, and then moves to our occipital lobe in the back of our head. So I personify, and I say regulates consciousness because there's a lot of things that go on that the thalamus has to kind of switchboard operate. If you've ever seen an old movie with, you call the operator and you say, connect me with Klondike 57423. And then they put these things in. That's what the thalamus does. It's sending information between parts of your brain, as does your gray matter. I personify her as Miss Thala, the switchboard operator. So like in an old movie, you call Miss Thala, you say, hey, will you connect me to the occipital lobe? And she says, coming right up. And she switches that. So Miss Thala is your switchboard operator. And by the way, all of these things we're talking about pretty much are symmetrical. And anything that is in one hemisphere is going to be on the other. So you have two amygdala. You have two, hold up one finger. You have two amygdala. You have two hippocampi. You have all of those. The thalamus is in the, actually you do have two thalamuses. The cerebrum is split in half, so it's a very symmetrical brain. Anything on one side is going to be on the other with one exception. And we'll talk about that coming up. Gosh, I'm not even going to get through this slide if I keep talking. Then we look at the pons. Pons means bridge. There's a lot going on with the pons, with breathing and sleep and dreams. This is one of the very few times I've seen on an AP test where they showed a brain. It's just like eggs type structure. They drew an arrow at it, and the multiple choice was, what part of the brain is that? and you had to know it was the pons. They don't do that very often, but the pons for some reason was one they did. I don't know, it's maybe 2-3 years ago. Okay. The cerebellum, right here, the little brain. This is balance, this is motor control. And remember, when we were talking about retrograde and anterograde memory, let's say you lose the ability to make new memories. You have anterograde amnesia. If you lose the ability to make new memories, you can still learn to do things. You can remember how to. You don't remember how you learned it, though. So if somebody has complete anterograde amnesia, they can still learn to play piano, to do a maze. Why? Because there's procedural memory stuck right back here. Now our declarative memory is all up here, but our procedural memory is down here. Also super important here, balance and motor control. Now, since it's in our brainstem, it's like we couldn't stand up straight if we didn't have the cerebellum. We couldn't coordinate our muscles at all if we didn't have the cerebellum. So there's a very dense part of your brain back there, very rich, a lot of neurons. And all of this, and I should have put the brainstem first, but I would have had to put the brain upside down. This is all part of the brainstem. And again, what you need to remember, if you only remember one thing from today, brainstem is just your vital functions. What do you need to do to be alive, to stand up, to walk around, to eat? All those very, very basic things. So I've already talked for 11 and a half minutes, my longest video. I really, really apologize. I'm going to let Mr. Davis pick it up from here.